Well, it's good to be with everyone out there in podcast land. This is Father Michael Vinson. I'm the vicar of St. Benedict's Anglican Church in Rockwall, Texas, and you are with the Everyday Monks. And I'm glad to have the Reverend Michael Keith Templin, who's Associate Rector here, Assisting Priest at St. Benedict's. Michael, how have you been?
Been great. How about you, Michael?
Been doing just fine, thank you. Glad that you're here. And also have Timothy Wilson, who is a postulant for Holy Orders in the Reformed Episcopal Church, also a member of this parish. And glad to have you with us, Timothy, again, as usual. How are you?
Doing very well. It's good to be here.
I understand that you had a big day this week.
Turned the big 5-6.
5-6, 56. Happy birthday, my friend.
Thank you much.
God bless you, and so glad that God gave you us, your gift to this parish, and I appreciate your friendship. And it's good to be back. We had a little bit of a hiatus, and we appreciate your patience as we kind of wrapped up the summer. And so this edition of the podcast in the series that we've been kind of going through called Why, and in this series of Why, we're asking the question about why we do the things we do as Anglicans or Christians, why we worship the way we worship, why we do the things that we do. And we're trying to answer kind of the big questions. And we've talked about the creeds, we've talked about why the church, and I think we've had some pretty interesting conversations. I know I've had a lot of good feedback from people, and which is what brings me to my next statement. That over the last several weeks, when we've been doing this podcast on why, we've been getting quite a few questions coming in from listeners like yourself and people within our parish or just people that listen and catch us on the street. So we thought that today, as we kind of continue this series, we do a podcast answering some of the questions that we've gotten from our listeners. So over the next several minutes, we're going to be addressing questions about why certain things are happening or whatever, and these are going to be questions that we've compiled from you out there in podcast land. So without any further ado, should we just jump in?
I think we should.
All right, let's jump in. So of course, as usual, there's really no prep for this, so I've got the questions and I'm going to ask my two friends here to chime in. So we're going to start with some basic questions, and the first one is, what is Anglican? Now, there you go. That's a pretty basic question, but I'm sure there's a lot of people out there that are wondering, what the heck is Anglican? What does it mean? So, Father Templin, you want to tackle that one?
Sure. There's probably many hours of discussion we could have on this one question alone, but
yes.
I think most simply Anglican means English. And refers back to the ancient church in England, and then at the time of the Protestant Reformation, the Church of England, and it's been used probably in perpetuity since, I'm guessing, the 2nd or 3rd century to refer to English Christians.
Okay, 2nd or 3rd. So we're going to come back to that because that connects
I could be making that up. But
well, of course you could. And that's why I want to ask Timothy. Timothy, you want to add to that?
That's a great place to start. A lot of people ask, what are those Anglicans? Or the assumption is, wasn't it started by Henry VIII?
Yeah, we hear that.
But no, the church in England, the English way of the liturgy is where Anglicanism got its start. Going back, we know to at least the 2nd century, probably the 1st century, if you consider the possibilities of the Roman trades coming into Britain.
Mm-hmm. And military.
In the military, right.
Which would be in the middle of the 1st century.
So by the time there were councils and things like this, bishops from England were there in attendance.
So Anglican is simply the English word for Angles, which means, again, English. So Anglican is referring to a geographical first location. Do you guys agree with that?
Yeah.
And it's referring to originating from the peoples, the Angles. And we're also locating the origin of the Anglican Church, or the Church of the Angles in Britain, to at least starting 2nd century, most likely 1st century, definitely by the 3rd century. Okay, so Anglicanism is...
Yeah, to piggyback off of that, Timothy referenced it, but where does that quote come from? Was it an emperor who saw the slaves from England, or maybe they were servants, and said they look like angels?
Right.
I can't remember what year that was. I might have been earlier than I should have been on the quote, but I'm pretty sure that's where it originates from.
Yes, 6th century.
Okay.
And it's Gregory the Great.
Okay, so it's Gregory.
And he has the vision of these, of course, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, these children and people that look like angels.
Yeah.
And so there's that connection as well. And then, of course, that sends a missionary movement back to Britain. And what happens when the missionaries arrive in Britain in the 6th century? What do they find in Britain? But a church.
A church already established.
Yeah, established church.
Yeah.
Okay.
St. Augustine.
All right, you guys started off pretty good here for being off for a couple weeks. So, doing good. We'll get the motor running here. So here's a follow-up question that I had from somebody else, but I'll connect it to this. So is Anglicanism? It's really a two-parter. First, is Anglicanism a denomination? And number two, what is Anglicanism in America? How can that be? If I say I'm an Anglican and I live in Texas, what does that mean? So who wants to tackle that one? Denomination? Yes or no?
I would say yes. I
Okay.
think, and just the way we currently understand divisions of the church based upon particular confessions or creeds or whatever. I guess technically we would be a communion. But that's probably a much longer discussion as well, because that whole Anglican communion thing is currently, in the last 20 or 30 years, been in a process of perpetual realignment. So I'm not really sure how accurately we can describe Anglicanism as a communion right now. So, short answer, I think most people, when you're filling out a religious survey, denomination would work fine. If you're getting into the weeds, communion's probably the more technical.
And in the United States, carrying on the apostolic succession, we've used the term Episcopal.
Right.
Right.
So when someone says, for instance, we're St. Benedict's Anglican Church, we're not St. Benedict's Episcopal Church, but we are a part of the Reformed Episcopal Church, who is a sub-jurisdiction within the ACNA, or the Anglican Church of North America. So you can see right there, there's a whole lot of layers and a whole lot of terminology that's interchanged, but means one thing at a certain emphasis and maybe means something else.
Yeah.
So this idea that the Episcopal Church in America, of course, has its roots from the Church of England. So if I say, and this is just my explanation, if I say that I'm an Anglican, what I'm saying is that I'm not a part of the Protestant Episcopal Church in America, or TEC.
Right.
But I'm a part of the ACNA, Reformed Episcopal Church. So I choose to use Anglican instead of Episcopal because I want to make that demarcation between the Episcopal Church in America and the Anglican Church in North America.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, and originally it was to distinguish ourselves from an ethno-national church.
Right.
Which was the Church of England. And we weren't the original church to call ourselves the Episcopal Church. That was Scotland.
Right.
for obvious reasons. The Scottish Episcopal Church, though they were Anglican in form and theology, they were also Scots, and didn't, like, going back to our initial conversation, didn't associate themselves with being English. And you can see why the Episcopal Church, when it started here in the United States after the Revolutionary War, probably did not want to call itself the English Church.
Right. Makes sense.
Right. And secondly, we procured part of our apostolic succession from Scotland as well. So
right.
It's natural, to adopt that terminology.
Right. And this was another thing that people had asked about is, well, what does it mean? What do you mean by Episcopal? Right. So we're of the Reformed Episcopal Church. So for people that don't understand what that means is, well, it's simply referring to the form of governance
Right.
of the churches, meaning that it is governed by bishops.
Yeah, episkopos is Greek for bishop.
Right. So we're answering the questions that people have been asking, some of these questions that there are some of you that may think, well, these are pretty basic questions, but we do have we're building a pretty good viewership or listenership of people that are curious about Anglicanism. So they're asking these kind of questions, and they're good questions. And I think from my experience in church planning, you need to kind of have an answer for these things because people are going to ask when they're curious. Okay, so we talked about what the word Anglican means, what its origin is. We talked about do we understand or speak of ourselves as a denomination? I thought that was a great answer, Father Templin. Technically we're a communion, but in today's world and the brevity of speech and thought between people, denomination is probably okay to use for people just to understand and kind of move forward and not get hung up on the technicalities of all that. So I want to move to another question, and this kind of goes back to we've already answered this, but I want to circle back to if there's anything that we need to add. But when was the Anglican Church founded, and how does it actually come into formation? I think we already answered that. Is there anything that you want to add to the founding of the Anglican Church?
I mean, which iteration do you have in mind?
Well, I don't know. I'm just asking the question because then there's no preparation. I want to see how you respond to that question.
Yeah, I mean, so I might be an outlier here, but I do think that when we're being technical, I think most people when they ask that question are, wondering about the Reformation, essentially.
Right. And would you agree with that, Timothy?
Yes.
That's always a Reformation question, right?
Right. Yeah. And so there was a kind of post-Tractarian ideology that developed where there was a push to shy away from the Reformation and cast everything in this, pre-Reformation, even pre-Roman light, and which, we just, talked about there being a church in England or whatever, Britain, during that time. But I think most people have in mind, the Reformed Church, the Church of England.
Right, and the questions over jurisdiction, obviously England, there was already theological conflicts with the Roman Church, but then England, being a sovereign country, did not want to come under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Rome. And so there needed to be a breakaway so that they could keep that sovereignty for one thing and answer the theological conflicts as well, as those were differing.
Yeah, and I think back to your point, Father Templin, because that's a good point. How self-conscious would the church in Britain in the 4th, 5th, 6th century had been about their identity or autonomy, in a sense? Like, were they a part of the Church Catholic? And really, what you were saying earlier is that the Reformation kind of forges a revisiting of identity. Like, okay, we've gone through a Reformation, and in a sense, it's different now, even though we're the same church that came through the Reformation. But there's a sense in which there's a beginning of Anglicanism in the Reformation, or how would you say that? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, no, I mean, for one, I think that the church has always been different in the sense that I think in each iteration, I mean, when you're talking about really early patristic era, there are a lot of different Christian movements that are taking place on the British Isle, and I don't think you have one unified.
There's no homogeneous Christianity,
precisely,
or an expression of Christianity at the very earliest, the nascent church.
Yes, and that really happens when they come under the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Rome. That's when things begin to get a lot tighter. And
so that would be in the Council of Whitby.
Yeah, Synod of Whitby.
Yeah, Synod of Whitby, etc.
7th century.
Yeah.
So, but even then, I mean, liturgically, there's still a lot of, I guess, variance depending on where you lived and which diocese you were in the Church of England, and that goes essentially through the time of the Reformation. So, I would say that the church has kind of always been in transformation, or in flux is not the right word, but that doesn't mean that orthodoxy changes, but that it's been some, kind of stagnant, or what's a better word than stagnant? So some like straight, linear, without any variance, movement, I think would be naive.
Development.
Yeah, there's been development,
but in the sense of ritual, you're not saying an orthodoxy per se. What you're saying is because of the various locations, the different cultures within, like the British Isles and that area of the world, or a part of, pick any country, that there's going to be variances or a diversity of things while still wrapped around the core essential faith.
Right.
Yeah. Interesting. Do you have any thoughts on that, Timothy?
Well, I do have a question, Father Templin. What about the conciliar ability after there were no longer the call for the entire church to be able to come together? What about after the Fifth Ecumenical Council? And these various, even geographical areas like that, even of England, trying to maintain not only their own identity, but this conciliar matters of orthodoxy playing into that identity.
Yeah, so how did they do that? Is that your question? You have it goes even at the same time as ecumenical councils. You have local councils that deal with a lot of that, and those are especially active in the Roman Communion. You start dealing with a lot, and those local councils, a lot of stuff that end up, either being rejected by the Protestants or turn into dogmatics at the Council of Trent. A lot of that sort of stuff takes place during that time. I think that what was the second part of your question?
Well, how do you see that playing into the forming of the Anglican identity post, or going through the Reformation?
Yeah, so really like the early medieval,
yes,
going into the late medieval prior to the Reformation. That period of kind of the ecumenical councils after the Fifth Council, Seventh Council, and that period up until the 15th, 16th century. Are there homogeneous movements? Like, for instance, we see the prominence of the Salisbury Rite, right? You see over time in the medieval period. I mean, how does that happen apart from ecumenical councils that are occurring? Is that what you're asking?
Right. Yes.
Well, I think at that time, diocese actually still mattered.
Oh, that's a great point.
And not that they don't today, but the bishop,
they operated differently,
right? And so rights and offices and those sort of things, those were done on a diocesan basis. Now they might be closely related to the Western liturgy of St. Gregory the Great, and some might be a little more of a looser interpretation. But pretty much each diocese, unless they're really minor dioceses, had its own liturgical life and its own altar missal. So when you get, like, when you read the preface of the Book of Common Prayer, it talks about the use of Hereford or Hereford, Salisbury.
Yep.
I believe York and Bangor are the four major
known liturgical.
Well, no, there were,
but I mean,
way more known. But those were the ones that Thomas Cranmer utilized the most, in the prayer book. But even in non-English and there's Aberdeen Rite, there's all sorts of stuff. And so each diocese, I mean, the bishop had his priests, his deacons, and there were monasteries and all sorts of things. So I would think there's a general Catholic Christianity, but there is a local flavor depending on where you go. So I don't know if that answers your question or not.
Oh no, that's very good.
Yeah, but I mean, that's an interesting thing to think about, is the development. I mean, just in particular liturgical development over a 1,500-year period from a church that begins, maybe as early as the 2nd century or 1st century. Because, we live in a time where, we've got a prayer book, and it's not a diocesan understanding in a sense, right?
Right.
Now, there's diocesan customaries, but we don't have different rites between the Diocese of Mid-America doesn't have a different rite than, the Diocese of the South.
Yeah, and so Henry, he's the one who moved essentially all of England. I don't know if it was ever accomplished or not, but the goal was, prior to the Reformation, to move everyone to the use of Salisbury, so that there would be some control and to kind of get everybody on the same page. And then from there he started introducing some kind of proto-reforms, like reading or the administration of the sacrament or something in English or those sort of things. But that was based upon a unified rite, and the articles talk about national churches having the ability to form their own rites and those sort of things. But earlier on, it was a more diocesan thing.
Right. Yeah, that makes sense.
And really early on, it depended upon who the bishop was. Even because the dioceses were much smaller.
Right.
So even Eucharistic prayers, if you wanted to go really far back, they would change depending on who the celebrant was. And that starts really in the 2nd through 3rd centuries, starts to get more formalized and concrete, but that was definitely not the practice in the early church.
Well, that's a great segue, because another really good question that let me scroll through my list here. Here it is. Yeah, the origins of. So let's talk about then what would the origins of the Anglican liturgy be as we have it today? Like, where does it start? Where does it come from? Well, how historic is this liturgy, Timothy?
It's like asking what the origin of liturgy is. To that you'd have to go back, because we in some sense have a copy of that which was done from the beginning. If you want to talk about morning evening prayer, we can go back and talk about the morning and evening sacrifices that happened in the Old Testament. So we have our origins and what God was doing in Israel at the time, and from Israel into the New Testament church. We have those things being carried over in types and copies.
Yeah, and that's such a great. I'm glad that you began in the Old Testament, in the prescribed worship of God in the people of Israel, in the Church of Israel. Because I do come across a lot of people that, they associate liturgical worship with, well, that must have been something that man put in place after Constantine. In other words, there are people who view liturgy or think of liturgy as, well, that must have been a man prescribed deal that went along with kind of this coalescing of authority around a Roman church and Constantine, and then, well, this is how you're going to worship now. And it's a common misconception, which is why I really appreciate that you kind of started your answer within the worship of Israel.
Yeah, because, I mean, the principle that Augustine laid out holds when it comes into the understanding of liturgy. I mean, the new and the old is concealed, and the old and the new is revealed.
Right.
And that's how it's carried on.
Okay, so that's a great kind of a foundation that Christian worship, has its origins in the people of God of Israel. But back to my question, so how would you answer, well, where does the Anglican liturgy kind of derive from? And from when?
Yeah, so you read the book of Acts, the missionaries are evangelizing in the synagogues, and there had already been a movement as Judaism had been dispersed outside of Israel and outside of Judah and outside of Jerusalem, to set up forms and prayers and worship and lectionary and all of that sort of stuff.
Right.
And so if the worship in the early church was temple-centric, if it still was, if you lived in Jerusalem, or synagogue-centric, if you lived outside of Jerusalem, well, you can see, obviously, where it would develop.
So it's developing out of temple and synagogue worship. Right.
So when you get to some of the earliest patristic writings, like the Didache, you get times of the day. It's 3 times a day, if I remember correctly, where the church is instructed, morning and around lunchtime, and then in the evening, are instructed to pray the Lord's Prayer. And they're instructed on fasting days and this, that, and the other. So this is happening very early on. Now, within that, we don't have a whole lot of texts that early on what exactly was being said in these prayers other than Lord's Prayer.
Right. We have a few, like Melito of Sardis, and we have a few extant, early liturgies, but you're right.
Right, and then you get to 100 years later or whatever, or 50 years, with Hippolytus of Rome, and he talks about what we would call the daily office as well, and it becomes a little more elaborate.
Right.
And then you really get the kind of the full thing when we see monasticism develop.
Right.
And it probably developed at cathedrals, like the offices probably developed in cathedrals first.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Because when you read the Pilgrimage of Egeria or something like that, and she's going to these cathedral or monastic communities.
In Jerusalem.
There's several hours of prayer already going on.
It's a very robust and full liturgy going on in Jerusalem under Cyril.
Right, and this hasn't, in this area, hasn't been touched by, Benedict or anything.
Right.
So
this is early on.
Right. So.
Yeah, great point. So I there was kind of this one source kind of idea of liturgy that kind of floated around several years ago, but I think it's Blunt who really kind of develops. He makes the case for several liturgies that come from the apostles, or different liturgies that come out of the ministries of, an Ephesus of St. John and St. Mark, St. James, right? Paul. And he doesn't really have a one, there's just one liturgy that they all had, and then they all went out and started planting churches. So the apostolic origin of what ends up being the Anglican liturgies, I guess, or liturgy, is traced through St. John's liturgy in Ephesus, and then intersects with the Roman liturgy in the 6th century. And so we have this interesting development liturgically in the Anglican part of Christ, one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, of kind of an Eastern sense, an Eastern reality along with the Western reality. From a liturgical standpoint, of course, it's also influenced by the Gallican liturgy in Spain. Mm-hmm. So it's kind of a unique. I mean, would you say, Father Templin? Because I mean, you don't ever say this, but I mean, I tell people all the time that you're probably the top liturgical scholar that I know, and I say that because it's true, but I also say it because you're my friend and fellow priest. But it is true. I mean, is there a certain uniqueness to the Anglican liturgy that is there, or am I just kind of making that up?
Do you mean you're talking about the ancient?
Yeah, just the the Ephesus liturgy and the Roman liturgy. It's just it seems to me it's a very unique thing that occurs liturgically in Britain.
What's interesting when you look at the Latin forms of the Mass that were used prior to the Reformation.
Yeah.
Once again, going back to Salisbury because that's probably the most popular. Mm-hmm. It's more elaborate than what was being used at Rome at the time.
Interesting. I didn't know that.
Yeah.
Okay.
So a lot more prayers. There's antiphons that are attached to the Kyrie. In the rubrics, it calls for the liturgical fans, like are still used in the Eastern rites of the Church. So there's some peculiar stuff there, and so it's probably to celebrate the use of Salisbury was probably one of the most complicated masses to do a solemn mass. In all of the church at that time, at least in the West, and so some of that could most definitely be the Eastern influences because their liturgies tend to be a little more elaborate than the Western liturgy. Because that was one of Gregory's major reforms was the Mass, because it was still being celebrated into the 3rd, maybe into the 4th century in Greek in Rome, and then it got put into Latin.
That's right. And
it had been prior more of a Kyrie or litany-based liturgy, which is more Eastern-centric, or what we would think of in like Chrysostom or the James's liturgy.
Right.
And so it was simplified, to say the least.
Okay, let me get to this. This is a good question. Are Anglicans, or is the Anglican Church Catholic, Protestant, or evangelical?
Yes.
Okay, Timothy, you jumped in there. Timothy. Go ahead. You go first.
Yes, we are Catholic. We are universally Orthodox. Are we Protestant? Yes, there were eras in the medieval church that needed to be addressed and reformed. Are we evangelical? Yes, in the sense that we carry on the ministry worldwide. So, I mean, the answer to all of them is yes. Are we more one than another?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah. That would get into a lot more nuances. Are we more Catholic than we are Protestant? I would say yes. Others may disagree. And we have a number of flavors within Anglicanism. You have some that identify as the evangelical Anglican or Reformed, as in more Calvinistically speaking, Anglican. We have a really broad area there, but in those broad categories, yes, we're all three. Do we have nuanced? Yes. I'll let Father Templin weigh in on more of the
Reformed,
nuances.
Catholic, evangelical, Protestant.
So I'll start with Catholic. Yes, we confess that we are members of the one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church.
Okay.
When we recite the creeds. So I don't think there was ever in any reformer's mind the desire to leave the Catholic faith. So yes, no, we're Catholics, and I think what the true sense of the word is, according to the whole.
Right. Catholics.
Yes.
Yeah. Universal.
Right, and therefore, that's the reason we're Protestant and Reformed, because what was Catholic changed, most definitely, in the Middle Ages.
Right.
And so the reason you protest that is because there has been a corruption in doctrine and practice in the church that needed to be reformed.
Right.
And that's the whole reason the Reformation happened.
Right.
So the idea is to go back to a pure church or pure gospel, and that's why we're also evangelical, because we're centered around the proclamation of the gospel.
Right.
I mean, that's
Evangelion.
right.
Yeah.
That's the main. That should be the main stress. Is are people hearing the good news of Christ's kingdom? So, yeah, I would say we're all of the above, and there's only protests because there
was something to protest.
Right. The gospel was in danger of being lost, and what was truly Catholic had been corrupted. So there had to be a reformation.
So, trick question: St. Paul,
Sure.
is he evangelical or Catholic?
Yes.
I guess both. All right.
Well, but I mean, we giggle, but again, in our church plant, and of course, I think across a lot of Anglicanism, when people are coming into the church that aren't Anglicans, and they're coming in and they hear us profess, one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, and they don't know what they think Rome,
Right.
because they don't know haven't understood what Catholic means.
Yeah.
Which is fine. I mean, you figure that out. But in terms of the book that came out recently, Reformed Catholic Anglicanism, Reformed Formed Catholic Anglicanism by Anglican Way Institute Press, that came out of the REC. So we refer to ourselves as Reformed Catholics, as Anglicans. But we understand reform a noun or a verb?
I guess it depends on who you ask.
Well, that's the thing, right? So a lot of people when they're speaking about "Are you reformed?" it's a noun for them.
Right.
It's a category, a theological category.
The Reformed churches.
Correct.
Yes.
But that's not what we're talking about when we say reformed.
Right.
So to reform something is to change it back to what it was.
Right.
So the question is, well, what was the Reformation reforming? And it was the Catholic faith.
Right.
Which is that's how we speak of reformed Catholicism. So if you don't have, if you're thinking modified Catholic, meaning Roman Catholic or English Catholic or Spanish Catholic, you're already down a different road than what we're talking about. When we're talking about Reformed Catholicism, we're talking about the Catholic faith that was once delivered, as you said, Father Templin and Timothy, that needed to be recovered and needed to be changed. There needed to be some corrections, and we had to get back to what was before the errors occurred. Which brings me to the next question. We have this one and one more. The next question is, so do Anglicans understand themselves as the true church? Do Anglicans speak of themselves as the only one true church?
Exclusively?
Yes.
No.
Okay. What do we say?
I mean, if the Word of God's preached, then the sacraments are administered. That's where the church is.
Right. So Catholicity, we understand ourselves, I would say, we understand ourselves as part of that one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. whose origins are in Britain. So we don't claim to be the church. We claim to be a part of the church, of the Catholic Church. And I think that's important. We get a lot of people that come into Anglicanism and, they're thinking along the lines of exclusivity of maybe they've experienced in other parts of the church, whether it was Rome or in the East. And then they see what we're doing and they think, well, this is a lot like Roman Catholicism, or they feel like they're now in a Catholic environment. And then the next thing they think is, well, can I participate? Can I take communion? Well, do they not think I'm Christians because, I'm coming from a Baptist church or a Methodist background? So I think it's important to reiterate that. It's a great question. No, we don't see ourselves as the only one true exclusive church.
A church that does is a church that really unchurches people.
And the last question is from, looks like it's from Mary. Let me pull up this email.
From Yorkshire.
Well, look at that. From Yorkshire. Okay, so Mary asks, do Anglicans believe in transubstantiation? Which is a great finishing question because we're about to embark on a section of this podcast where we start getting into sacrament. Those will be coming up over the next several weeks. So, Timothy, because we've allowed Father Templin to enlighten us and really engage in some great conversation, do Anglicans believe in transubstantiation?
Short answer, no.
Okay.
We do believe in real presence.
Okay.
Which is very important, but we do not believe that the elements themselves lose their substance and become corporally the body of Christ.
I think it's Pascal who talks about that we don't believe that grace destroys nature.
Correct.
Or the grace of God or the power of God doesn't destroy the natural.
Right, it perfects.
It perfects the creature or the natural. So Pascal, who I think is really helpful, and I'm sure he'll come up in our sacramental conversations, he holds divine supernatural grace and material creature. Those two things hold together, and the supernatural perfects the natural. So I think that's helpful. So real presence, spiritual presence. How do you feel comfortable speaking about that when you're just engaging with people that are asking you about these things, about what we believe around transubstantiation or not? Do you speak in real presence terms or spiritual presence? How do you talk about it?
I mean, it's best to speak in real presence terms. Mm-hmm. He is there efficaciously. We don't go beyond what Scripture tells us. We do leave it as a mystery.
Yeah.
We don't go through the hubris of trying to explain the how. I think it goes beyond Scripture, and where Scripture is silent, we remain silent, and we reverently hold to the mystery. But Christ is there. Sacramentally, we go through the human actions of the liturgy of the sacrament, but it's God's work. Mm-hmm. It's God acting.
God bears and does something to the natural.
Right. And then time is transcended through it. Yeah.
Which, that's kind of the way it always works, right? I mean, God moves first. God acts upon the material, the created. We see this, Genesis 1. We see that even in our own salvation, God loves us first before we love Him, etc. What do you want to? How do you answer that, or what are your thoughts on? Do Anglicans believe in transubstantiation? What would you add to that?
Yeah, no, the articles obviously forbid the belief in transubstantiation. So
medieval transubstantiation in particular. I mean, that's what they're talking about.
Right.
Whatever that understanding of transubstantiation was at the time of the Reformation.
Yes,
that's what the articles are speaking to.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so does that mean that Anglicans in the pews believe in transubstantiation. I'm sure there's a ton of them, and I'm sure there's priests that do as well. But formally, we're not allowed to teach it. Secondly, the Catechism in the prayer book uses the traditional Augustinian understanding of sacrament,
right?
Outward, visible sign.
Inward spiritual grace.
Exactly.
Holds the two together.
Right. So, with the understanding of transubstantiation during the time of the Reformation, you essentially lose the bread and the wine. Now, Rome has articulated or had development in their doctrine and all of that sort of stuff. And I guess the articles were probably that article was even written, if I remember correctly, and it was probably changed from the original 42 to 39. I'm sure got edited. But that was written before the Council of Trent,
right? As
well, if I remember correctly. So no, I don't think it would be appropriate to talk in terms of transubstantiation.
Yeah, and I agree with that.
Yeah. Now,
plus, I think you step into a field of landmines when you even want to try and articulate transubstantiation as the way you speak about presence.
And I would say even talking about trying to articulate spiritual presence, which the article does use, and there's a lot of different opinions and interpretations on there. And then you also get Lutheran language that ends up getting used in kind of our third body of formularies. The Book of Homilies, it talks about the body of Christ, in and under.
Yeah.
That language that Luther
uses. Right. Very influenced by the Lutheran scholars, yeah.
So there, I don't know. I know that we can't believe in memorialism or Zwinglianism.
Right. So excarnational, we don't believe in non-presence.
Right. And we can't believe in what was being articulated by Rome or as the Roman position during the time of the Reformation.
Which is the destruction of the material.
Right. I think probably a high Calvinist view or a Lutheran understanding is probably somewhere in the middle.
And it's too bad that we don't have our Presbyterian monk with us today, Pastor Mark, because he could have spoken right to that about the Calvin's understanding of presence.
But I think we're going to have a why on.
But we are going to have a why on why the Sacrament of Holy Communion.
Yeah, and I think we'll have Bishop Sutton on that day.
You think?
Yeah, I think we'll try to get him on. He's got a new book coming out on the sacraments.
Oh, that'd be a great idea. Yeah, so let's do that. So what we'll do is over the next several weeks as the podcast continues, we now move into Sacrament. I think what we'll do is the next time we gather is we'll just start talking about sacramentality. Let's just talk about what that is, etc. And then we'll move into the sacrament of baptism. Then we'll move into the sacrament of Holy Communion or Eucharist. And why don't we see if our dear bishop would be willing to sit in and be a guest monk with us on that podcast.
Sure.
And you said he's got a book coming out as well?
He does, yeah. I think Timothy
actually got two volume.
Yeah, Timothy's got to read some of it for seminary.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah. Oh, yes.
Oh, excellent.
It's not published yet, so they're
okay. So Bishop Sutton has a book coming out that is obviously being prepared to be published. It's not published yet, and well, that's great. So let's plan to have Bishop Sutton, if he's willing and able and has the time to grace us with his presence, and we'll sit down with him and the monks and him, and we'll talk Eucharistic theology, and then maybe we'll do kind of a final sacramental discussion on just the lesser sacraments and maybe some follow-up things, and I'm sure we'll have more questions from people by that point on sacraments, so we can include some of those conversations and questions. I appreciate the questions that we've been getting, and I hope this is, at least if it's not helping people, that's the goal, but if nothing else, to stir thought and to really think through kind of what you're doing and why you're doing it, and we just hope that it is benefiting you as it's benefiting us. And so until the next time we get together, May God bless you, and we hope to see you next time on Everyday Monks podcast.